Welcome back to Bombastic Nation and Ting and Ting and Ting. Back with more vibe for you. Yes, I'm telling you, this one here, I'm gonna watch this one for several reasons, right? It's called 10-Minute History, the Russian Revolution. It's like a short documentary. And it's kind of ironic because there's a sort of correlation, for me at least. We talk about the Russian Revolution. In 1979, my little island had a revolution, and the people that our government had turned to for help at the time was the Russians. Can't remember who the president of Russia was. I should have looked that up before we do this, so I could give you more details on that. But uh, that's sort of the correlation. The Russian Revolution. I've been to two revolutions pretty much, a Russian and a coup d'état they called it. So I wanted to, learn more about the Russian Revolution itself. So hence we're gonna watch this, and I hope you guys enjoy it with me. So let's go ahead and YouTube and simmer and see what I go on here.
1894, and Nicholas II has just been coronated as the Emperor of Russia. Before continuing, there's a technical matter which needs to be resolved: the calendar. To simplify, the Russian calendar was 13 days behind the Gregorian calendar in use today, which is why some things like the October Revolution are said to have occurred in November. For this episode, both calendars will be used. So, Nicholas II was an absolute monarch, which meant that he had the final say on everything concerning the Russian Empire, which was huge. During the late 19th century, Russia had seen rapid industrialization. Alongside this came new ideas such as the communist ideals of a certain Karl Marx, which led to the working class of Russia demanding greater representation. So, to grossly oversimplify, communism is a political ideology which argues that the means of production, such as factories, should be collectively owned by everyone as opposed to individuals. It wanted to abolish social classes and believed that the economy should be entirely controlled by the central government. The Imperial Russian government suffered from being somewhat distant and incompetent. For example, agriculture was slow to industrialise and there were numerous foreign policy failings. The most notable of these failings were the ones which caused conflict with the Japanese, leading to the 1904 Russo-Japanese War. So, to simplify, the reasons for war can largely be chalked up to Japan expanding its influence in Korea and Russia refusing to accept it. The Japanese decided that war would settle it and so launched a sneak attack against the Russian fleet in Port Arthur, which Russia had leased from China. The Japanese would continue with a string of victories such as the Battle of Mukden and the Battle of Tsushima. This embarrassed the Russians, and during peace negotiations led by a certain Sergei Witte, Russia lost Port Arthur and half of Here. Unfortunately for Russia, military defeat wasn't their only problem at this time. The most notable event was called Bloody Sunday, in which a priest called Father Gapon led a procession through Russia's capital St. Petersburg to present a
It's ironic because we had a one of the riots and stuff that we had in our little island called Bloody Sunday too. There was also a Bloody Monday. Now I'm going by memory here, and I was like a teenager at the time, but yep. So that's where they got it from. Okay.
petition to the emperor. The crowd was fired upon, leading to hundreds of deaths, which then caused riots across the empire. Witte was tasked with ending the rioting and presented a compromise: the formation of political parties and an elected assembly called the Duma. For the record, this Duma was mostly useless since it had no authority and Nicholas II could still do whatever he wanted. There were some elections and the emperor appointed a new prime minister, Pyotr Stolypin. Stolypin would bring about much needed agricultural reform before being assassinated in a theatre in 1911.
Wow.
In front of the emperor. 1914 was a big year for Russia since St. Petersburg was renamed to Petrograd because it sounded more Russian. Another event which was also probably important was the First World War, in which Russia had mixed success. To raise morale and against the advice of literally everyone, Nicholas appointed himself as the head of the army. He left his wife, Empress Alexandra, in charge of the capital with her advisor, Grigory Rasputin. After Russia's failings on the Eastern Front, Rasputin was blamed for corrupting the royal family and was eventually assassinated in 1916. Nicholas, as the head of the army, was seen as responsible for the failings of the war. War fatigue and food shortages led to protests which Nicholas had hoped to put down with the army. Well, the army mutinied and joined the protesters. In order to calm the situation, some Russian generals met with Nicholas and urged him to abdicate, which he did in 1917. Nicholas's abdication led to certain exiled peoples, most notably Vladimir Lenin, returning to Russia. It was people like Lenin who undermined the new provisional government by forming a rival one, the Petrograd Soviet. Lenin immediately began calling for the overthrow of the provisional government, promising the Russian people land, food, and an end to the war. The provisional government had decided not to end the war, and many people took to the streets to protest, and at the front of this protest stood Lenin's communist faction, called the Bolsheviks. The government forces decided to open fire, and many prominent Bolsheviks, such as Leon Trotsky, were arrested, and Lenin was forced to flee to Finland. Trotsky wouldn't spend long in prison since the new Russian Prime Minister, Alexander Kerensky, appointed a new head of the army,
Before you go further, I'm telling you, man, being in the middle of a riot and you don't know who's coming at you and you can't tell, and you know, I guess it was a Bloody Monday one. I remember sitting in my window and most of the action was happening 2 streets down, and you see what we used to call the secret police at the time coming in with the machetes and the sticks and they singing, and they just like crashed into the crowd and riots start. And everybody just starts scattering. There's school children running everywhere and screaming. And I remember people running up the steps by my house and trying to come in my house to hide from getting beaten up or chopped up or whatever. Man, it's the most confusing thing to be a part of. It is.
via Kornilov. Kerensky and Kornilov quickly fell out, and Kornilov marched his troops on Petrograd. Kerensky released many of the Bolsheviks since their military arm, the Red Guard, were the only ones that could stop Kornilov. Kornilov never reached Petrograd due to Bolshevik sabotage and was later arrested. Lenin returned to Russia and, in a shocking turn of events, called for the overthrow of the government. This time, the overthrow was to be violent. Lenin placed Trotsky in command of the revolution. The Bolsheviks seized city infrastructure, Kerensky fled, and shortly afterwards the Bolsheviks seized the Winter Palace, the seat of the Russian government. Lenin then declared to the Petrograd Soviet that the Bolsheviks were now in control, and Trotsky dismissed their opponents. Immediately after the revolution, Lenin announced 3 decrees. There was the decree on peace, which promised to put an end to the war, the decree on land, which abolished private land ownership and allowed peasants to divide land amongst themselves, and the decree on workers, which introduced a minimum wage. Lenin also brought in universal healthcare and education, increased the rights of women, alongside accepting Finland's declaration of independence. The Bolsheviks announced that there would be free and fair elections the next month, which the Bolsheviks lost. This was not what Lenin had planned, so he ordered the Red Guard to shut down the elected assembly and had himself placed in charge. Moscow was declared Russia's new capital, and Lenin switched to the Gregorian calendar. In the March of 1918, after some tough negotiations and an invasion, Trotsky and a team of delegates managed to secure a humiliating peace with the Central Powers. This treaty, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, gave up all of this territory to Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, although they themselves would be forced to give this up in the Treaty of Versailles. To many in Russia, this peace was long overdue. To others, such as the Czechoslovakian Legion, it was a complete betrayal. The Czechoslovakian Legion had fought for Russia in the First World War in return for Czechoslovakian independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. After peace was declared, they revolted. Their initial success spurred other enemies of the Bolsheviks to take up arms as well, thus beginning the Russian Civil War in earnest. In terms of the factions, the Bolsheviks and their supporters are called the Reds, those who opposed them are known as the Whites. Britain, France, Japan and the United States elected to intervene on the side of the Whites. It was mostly to reopen the Eastern Front against Germany, but there was also a great worry about the spread of communism. The Whites were initially very successful, but it wasn't long before their progress stalled. This was because they weren't very unified, and many of those fighting against the Bolsheviks were fighting for their own independence, not to restore the Russian Empire. The White generals were also somewhat useless. For example, Alexander Kolchak struggled to keep his officers sober, insulted his allies, and executed tens of thousands of people, turning them to the Bolshevik cause. He did manage to capture Yekaterinburg, where the former emperor was being held. The Bolsheviks didn't want the emperor to fall into enemy hands, and so he and his family were executed on July 17, 1918. The Reds had the advantage of geography. Their territory was much more compact and had greater levels of industrialization. It had better infrastructure, lines of communication, raw materials and a larger population. To maintain order in this area, the Bolsheviks began what is called the Red Terror. This involved sending dissidents to work camps, shooting protesters, and Trotsky holding the families of generals hostage so they'd stay loyal. Eventually it became clear to the Allies that the Bolsheviks were going to win. The Allies withdrew and the Czechoslovakian Legion returned to Czechoslovakia, which was independent by then anyway. The collapse of the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires meant that many peoples in Eastern Europe were looking to establish their own nations and borders. The Polish, led by Józef Piłsudski, wanted to expand the newly independent Poland at the cost of Russia. At the same time, the Bolsheviks were also looking to spread communism to their neighbours and reconquer Russia's old territories. The Bolsheviks also believed that the turmoil in Germany and the former Austro-Hungarian Empire meant that communist governments could be set up there as well. In 1919, the Polish invaded Ukraine and captured Kiev. The Bolsheviks counterattacked and forced the Polish all the way back to Warsaw. The Polish repulsed the attack, thus maintaining their independence and stopping Bolshevik forces from entering Germany. These borders were established, with Ukraine and Belarus becoming socialist republics, which were essentially Russian puppet states. Having failed to spread communism to Eastern Europe, for now, the Bolsheviks moved to secure their position in Russia. Lenin turned to fixing Russia's economic woes by implementing the new economic policy. This allowed some private enterprise, a distinctly non-Bolshevik ideal, to help revitalize the economy. In 1922, Russia and its surrounding socialist republics, which were nothing more than puppet states, agreed to form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Lenin had become unwell during the early 1920s and after a series of strokes was left bedridden until his death in 1924. Lenin's death left a power vacuum which only two men could fill. The first was Trotsky, the second was a certain Joseph Stalin. Stalin had played a role in the Russian Revolution prior to this, first as an editor of the Bolshevik newspaper and also as a commander in the Red Army during the invasion of Poland. By the time of Lenin's death, Stalin held the position of General Secretary, the highest political post in the USSR. Stalin was able to forge alliances with other prominent party members and concealed Lenin's criticisms of him. So Trotsky and Stalin held two distinct positions with how to proceed. Trotsky's position is known as permanent revolution. Trotsky felt that unless socialist revolution was encouraged in other countries, the Bolsheviks' revolution would halt and it would become impossible for the Soviet Union to survive. Whereas Stalin's belief, known as socialism in one country, argued that socialism within the USSR should be strengthened before it could be exported anywhere else. So, long story short, Stalin was victorious in the struggle for power, and in 1929 Trotsky was exiled from the Soviet Union. He ended up in Mexico, where he was assassinated in 1940.
Wow.
After his victory, Stalin began to tighten his grip over the Soviet Union. He did this via purges, assassination, censorship, and a secret police force, the NKVD. Stalin removed many members of the Communist Party and famously purged the officers in the Red Army. Stalin's most famous tools in maintaining order were the gulags, the successor to Lenin's work camps. The conditions in these camps were almost unbearable and the mortality rates were incredibly high. Stalin wasn't just a tyrant, he also brought about many domestic reforms such as the 5-year plans which were designed to improve industrial output, which it did to a miraculous degree. Another reform introduced was collectivization, whereby farmers were forced to unite their farms in order to increase crop yields and speed up mechanization. It should be remembered that Stalin's reforms changed Russia from an empire struggling to keep up to a political and economic powerhouse. So, in conclusion, the legacy of the Russian Revolution is hard to measure. In many respects, all it did was replace one authoritarian regime with another. It's worth noting that the actions of Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin and many others helped turn Russia into a superpower, one which was vital to stopping the Nazis. One area where it definitely changed the world was that it marks the last point in which Russia and the West saw each other as allies. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching.
Wow. It's funny. I mean, well, not ha funny, just strange funny. How they were just like fighting like crazy over there, and assassinations of people that was against them was commonplace. Even if you left the country, go to a whole different continent, they still find you and assassinate you. That happened to, well, he didn't go to another continent. There was a Nicaraguan, yeah, I think it's the Nicaraguan president, Somoza, that got assassinated here in New York. You know what I mean? It's like they follow people and kill them. I don't get that, man. What is wrong with us? All for power. And the thing about it is, they all end up withering away and dying, and they end up killing each other, and it doesn't make any sense. So, in essence, what I'm saying is, we keep making the same mistakes. We're not learning from history and going, we shouldn't do that now, should we? You got all these people over there, they have different countries and stuff, Just let these people live, man. And why you have to take this stuff from them? Because when you take stuff, you just create more problems for yourself because that's a whole new population coming in. That population ain't gonna like you, so you have to suppress them. And sometimes, obviously in those cases, violently, which you see happening like South America, in Africa, we just keep making the same mistakes over and over again. We don't know our history. We don't know where we're going. And we're going to make the same mistakes over and over and over and over and over. You know what I mean? Some of that I knew the surface story of it, but man, I didn't realize how vicious it was. That's just crazy. And here we are today. People wanting authoritarian people in power. It's just crazy. It's crazy. Making the same mistakes. Anyway, I'm going to Babylon. We're going to stop it. This was interesting. That's a really, really, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a, can you imagine the confusion? I mean, all those years, people just fighting. All those countries just warring against each other, taking territory, giving to, and it's still going on today. It's just crazy. But anyway, I'm gonna get over here. I enjoyed that. I learned a few things. I actually learned a few things here. And like I said, the correlation between us having a revolution and then the Russians coming and being our allies and stuff like that. So in essence, we were kind of part of the whole thing, but coming to the ending of it. You know what I'm saying? So that is crazy. That is crazy. Anyway, man, I hope you guys have a good evening, morning, whatever time it is where you are. Remember, take care of each other. Cool runnings.